Hey everyone, welcome to this Adobe Live with me. I'm your host, Justin Odisho, and today we're going to be going into a deep dive of mastering keyframes in Adobe Premiere Pro. Now, this might seem like a lot to do in under 30 minutes, but actually I think we're going to be able to give you the basic rundown of all the most important things and some of my favorite tips and shortcuts. So even if you know about keyframes, hopefully you're going to learn a couple things. So I'm working in Adobe Premiere Pro right now, and I've just got a couple of sample clips open. And what we're going to want to do when we're working with keyframes is, firstly of all, open up the Effect Controls panel. And if you don't ever see any window in Adobe Premiere Pro, always you can just go to the window and make sure that's checked on. But keyframes are probably one of the most foundational things. So whenever you have a clip, you have all these parameters about it. So in this case, we have the video. This is like position, scale, opacity. And whenever you apply an effect onto a clip, so if I go to the effects panel, and let's say I search for one such as the Gaussian blur effect. Whenever you apply an effect onto a clip, that also shows up in the effect control panel, and you can adjust those parameters as well. But if we wanted to make it animate from one position to the next, that's where keyframes come in handy. So if I started this clip at 0% blurriness, and you can always move around on your timeline, but if you notice in the effect controls panel, there's also this other timeline. This little stopwatch icon is the toggle animation button, and this is where we're going to be able to start adding keyframes. If you click on that stopwatch, you'll see that it adds a little timer. It's funny if you never recognized what that is. Yes, it is like a little stopwatch. And it also adds this little diamond. It looks like half a diamond right now because we're quite literally on the first frame. But if I move it around a little bit, you see it's a full diamond there. And that is allowing Adobe Premiere to recognize that at this point in the clip, we want to be at 0 blurriness. And then if I move forward in time a little bit, I can increase the blurriness to, let's just say 100. So I'll type in 100. Notice you can type or scale. And what the keyframes are going to do is go from point A to point B in something called interpolation. So this is going to interpolate. Let's make sure. All right. So as we play this clip, it's gently going to go from 0 to 100 blurry. And I can move and manipulate these keyframes around pretty easily with the selection tool. So you're not going to be able to unlock the power of all of these effects in the effects panel most of the time without keyframes. So let's dive in a little bit further. Let's say we have a clip where we want to gently zoom in. In this case, I can just use the scale keyframes on the motion section, and I can toggle animation there. And as I move further, I can gently zoom in. This will give us like a slight panning in effect. We don't necessarily need the audio there. And another thing about keyframes is that there's different types. So actually, why don't I use this Premiere logo so that we can kind of just see what's going on in a simple way. A quick tip here is whenever you're manipulating an effect or text, if I just highlight the motion section and scale down, or I can basically manipulate where I want things to be with this selection tool in the program monitor, instead of always having to use the sliders. That's just a quick tip. It's a little bit more intuitive. But let's say I want to make this Premiere logo go from left to right. We've already figured out how to do this much. We're going to go from left to right here. You can actually see that line, that blue line, showing us the path of motion, and it will just linearly interpolate. Now, if we ever right-click on any of the keyframes, there's the types of temporal interpolation. That's just a fancy way to say how it moves through time. Right now, it's linear, but we also have some other fancy words like Bezier and ease in and ease out that you might be familiar with. So if I choose ease in for the first keyframe, and I choose ease out, if I choose ease out for the first keyframe and ease in for the second, you'll notice the keyframes now have changed from a diamond to more of a curve. And if I press play, you see that the motion is slightly different. It gradually starts and then it gradually finishes. If you want to get a little bit even more advanced here, if you drop down that position menu, you can access the keyframe velocity. Now, this is one tip that I think will really make your edits look a lot better, is understanding how to use this keyframe velocity. Because as we see, if we just have the linear interpolation, it looks pretty generic, just boom, boom, kind of computerish. But if we want to make it look like a really great human editor edited this, we can just drop down the velocity section and we can open this graph. Now, you can always make these windows bigger, but I can pull on this little handle here and we can visually see on this graph what sort of speed ramping and velocity these keyframes are going to get. So now they're really going to start gradually, they're going to ramp up quickly, and then they're going to end quickly as well. So if I play this back, we get a really slick animation, and just with two little pulls of the handle, we went from basic editors, like let's turn it back to linear. We went from beginner editor to I'll press Command Z to, wow, this guy's an animation pro. Now, it may not be that simple, but you see how much that little difference makes. So there's actually a couple more types of keyframes as well. Let's say, I'm going to go back to that logo example in a second. But let's say we have a clip that we're trying to scale in on. So in this case, we have scale. And like I showed you before, we can do like a gentle pan to like an artificial zoom here. And that'll gently scale into the clip. That's a nice tip. But what if I wanted to cut into the clip? There's also things called hold keyframes. So we have linear, Bezier, which is like more of a gentle curve. And then we have our own custom velocity that we can do. But you can also do hold. So hold, you'll notice, will turn our keyframes into more of a square. And this will let Premiere know you're going to be at 100 at this point, and then we're not going to gradually interpolate. We're just going to, as soon as the next point comes, we're going to immediately cut into that amount. So hold keyframes are when you want to change the parameter, but you don't want to do it gradually. You just want to do it immediately. So cut, boom, boom. That might be another way to do it without cutting the clip as well. So those are basics of types of keyframes to know. I mean, most of the time I find myself just using, linear, not hold. But there's also some really powerful tips on when you're working with keyframes, how to manipulate and adjust. So firstly of all, if you notice these little arrow keys go to previous keyframe, that jumps from keyframe to keyframe. That's a great way for you to adjust audio, or that's a great way for you to go exactly to a keyframe point and adjust it. Another cool thing that people might not know is you can actually copy and paste. So I can select these keyframes. I can Command C, or if you're working on Windows, your copy shortcut, and Command V, and you can paste keyframes over and over. So that might, if you're doing a repetitive sort of back and forth effect, that might be a cool way to do it. And you can also click this little reset parameter button as a quick way to go back to 0. So let's say I want to create a gradual zooming out effect, and I've zoomed into the clip and I don't know how to go, or I don't necessarily want to mess with the slider and get it back to perfect. I can always just hit reset parameter. That'll take us back to our original 100% scale and also create a keyframe at the same time. Now, let's say I wanted to create a keyframe exactly at this point. That's what this diamond is, add or remove keyframe. That'll just add sort of a blank slate keyframe at whatever the current scale or position or parameter is at. So if I wanted to add one in the middle, that way I can squeeze it over. That's another way that you can do things. Now, you don't only have to adjust things in the effect controls panel. You can also do something really cool with the velocity where you can adjust things on the actual timeline. So let's add a couple different clips here. If I'm ever working on these clips in the timeline, I don't only have to work in the effect controls panel. I can double click on this track. It'll sort of increase the size a little bit. And already we're seeing this little line appear. So by default, this line is just the opacity line. That's one way to adjust it. And you'll notice as I adjust it here, it's also adjusting in the effect controls panel. That's a good way to hit reset. But if I right click on a keyframe, another cool thing that you can do is show clip keyframes, and you have all these options for some different ones. So one cool trick is the speed timer mapping. If I right click and click the show clip speed, that'll add this line, and this line represents the speed of the clip, which I can also add keyframes to. So in this case, we have one solid line, but if I hold the command or option, but if I hold the command button, that is, you'll see the cursor turn into a plus symbol, and I can click on that symbol, and that'll add a keyframe there. And if I add another plus, that'll add one there. And then I can take this middle segment and I can make that go 300% speed. So I can increase the speed there. And then you can even sort of feather out these points. So this is a really interesting one where you can do timer mapping. So that'll do a little bit of speed up at this section, and then it'll gently go back to 100% time. And if you notice in the effect controls panel, we see these little circles. That shows us that there's keyframes there. But if we drop down that menu, we can actually see the keyframes and adjust them. And there's also other viewing options, such as if you click here on this, you can show only the properties that you adjusted with keyframes versus all properties. Now, let's say you don't always want a keyframe every time. That's where you can actually use clip presets. So let's say I've made a cool effect here in the video effects folder. Let's grab the offset effect. Someone was asking me about this the other day. Offset. So if I add this effect onto the clip, it does this cool thing where you can shift the center. This can be really cool for when you have one person in the middle of the frame. But of course, we want to keyframe this so that it is like a spinning wheel. So I'll add a keyframe, I'll move over, and I'll make it rotate through itself a few times. And now if I ever right click on this effect, I can click Save Preset. So there's a few things that actually have to do with keyframes here as well that you might not know about, even if you know about keyframes a little bit. So the type shows you how it's asking Premiere, how do you want to work with the keyframes? Scale will take the same exact proportion that we have on this clip. So it looks like we've only applied the keyframe to the first 25% of the video, and whether I put in a 5-second video or a 5-minute video, it will always make the keyframe start at the first frame and go all the way to a quarter of the way in. Whereas anchor to endpoint, whether I put in a 5-second video or a 5-minute video, it will always make the keyframe start from the endpoint to, if it was only 5 frames, only 5 frames. And anchor to outpoint is the same, but on the other side. So if I do scale and press OK, then the beginning of these clips are always going to be spinning like that. And then if so that should be now in my preset panel. So I just created this preset, and it's called the offset preset here. So this clip is, let's see, it's about 9 seconds long. But if I add another clip that's much longer, and I add this offset preset. Because we chose scale, those keyframes will also take the same proportion of time. It's kind of weird in this clip because the train's already moving. But the cool part about presets is then you can go in and although we had a preset, we can always adjust it. So some cool examples of that are, here's some that I've created where it anchors to in and out points and some ideas on how you can use that to make your own custom transitions is like, here's a blinking effect. Let's add 2 clips here. We have a blinking effect where we've made use of velocity. So if I zoom in here, you could see some velocity to those keyframes. We've made use of anchoring to out point here, and we've made use of anchoring to in point on the second clip. And we've used the crop effect to create, if I play this back, we're gonna get a cool blinking in and out effect. So blink in and blink out. And you notice there's that nice touch of velocity that I showed with the Premiere Pro logo as well. So you could find tons of tutorials on that. I've done previous Adobe Lives where we deep dive into effects and such, but that is using keyframes to do all that and velocity as well. And a lot of people don't know how you can manipulate with like copy paste and jumping to and from keyframes and showing edited keyframes so you can go in there and adjust it. But as a small little bonus before we head towards wrapping up the stream, sometimes to know what something is, you also kind of have to know what it isn't. And I kind of wanted to share a bonus of 2 effects in Premiere that are sort of special because they don't even need you to have keyframes and they still create some kind of animation. And one of those is the wave warp effect. So if I grab the wave warp effect, this one's cool in that it's one of the only effects in Premiere where, let's turn on all properties again. It's one of the only effects in Premiere where even without adding keyframes, it's applying this sine wave. So if I press play, we get this cool wave warp effect. Just know that one, if it's animation without keyframes, I always find it very powerful because then the cool part is you can even go in there and add keyframes to it. So pretty cool one there. And then another one is strobe. So strobe is another really cool one where instead of cutting a clip repeatedly or using a bunch of keyframes, you can also just use the strobe effect, make layer transparent, and let's adjust the strobe duration and strobe period. This is another really cool one where it's doing something to the clip, it's sort of cutting and blinking the clip. I put another clip right underneath it. We're getting cutting without having to use keyframes. And don't forget that all of this can apply to audio as well. So if you ever have audio, you have the same options to add keyframes, and that's a great way that you can perhaps do audio ducking. So just the way we're doing the speed, we can also do audio ducking and ramping that way if you want to do it in a manual way. But I think that wraps up a quick deep dive into mastering keyframes. Obviously, there's so much more you can combine and do with this in Adobe Premiere. So check out some of the previous live streams that we've done where I've really deep dived into tinkering with the effects and making presets. But if you've mastered these tools, you should be on your way to becoming a better editor in Adobe Premiere Pro and the other apps. My name is Justin Odisho. Thanks for watching this stream, and we'll see you guys in the next one.